This morning is going to be coming from Mark chapter 14. If you'd like to take out a Bible and turn over there with me, you can follow along, read the story with me. Always find it more beneficial to myself rather than just listening. If I read along or try to read along with the past, it helps me remember a lot more of the lesson than if I don't. Just kind of a reminder, we're looking at the last week of Jesus' life here upon this earth. We're especially concentrating now, have been for the last couple weeks, on the night of his betrayal and arrest. And so Mark 14 is no different, but it's going to be taken from a very familiar scene, if you are familiar with the Bible and the New Testament especially, and that is the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, as I was putting this lesson together, this is one of those lessons where you got several verses, but we have it all in one today, so only got one lesson to look at. And I could have spent a lot of time, and if we did have two sessions, I probably would have. Could have spent a lot of time on the agony and the suffering of Jesus in the garden. But I think I'll kind of reserve that for the cross and might refer back to that as we look at that study. But what I do want to focus upon this morning is the arrest of Jesus in the garden, and specifically how, the behavior of the individuals who were involved in that night, and, some of the emotions that they experienced and what we can learn from that. Now, if you're familiar with the Garden of Gethsemane, you know that is a place where Jesus often went with his disciples. And he went there for, I think, several reasons. First of all, he went there, if he wanted to kind of relax a little bit, that's the place that he went to. If he wanted to get away from the people, if he wanted to get out of the eye of the public, that was a place where he frequented it in order to accomplish that. We also know that it was a place where Jesus often went to pray. And so it's only natural on this night, and considering what's going on in the city of Jerusalem, for Jesus to end up here. I just want to remind you that in Jerusalem, this is the time of the Passover. This is a time where thousands upon millions of Jews flocked into the Jerusalem area. And so it would have been a very crowded place, a place that would have been filled with people and travelers. And if you wanted to somehow get into privacy, you had to get out of Jerusalem. And so Jesus decides that night he's going to take his disciples along with him. He's going to go to the Garden of Gethsemane, to that private place. And he knew what was going to happen there. He knew that was the place that Judas was going to betray him. And he was ready for that. I guess about as ready as you could be to die. I don't know if you're ever really ready to die, but he knew what was waiting for him, and he knew what those steps and that time was leading to. And so he entered into that garden in obedience to the will of his Father. Now, what we learn about as we read is that he left 8 of his disciples. There's only 11 remaining at this time, or apostles, I guess I should more appropriately say. He left 8 of those apostles at the entrance of the garden. And then he took Peter, James, and John and went into another part of the garden to pray. What do you think Jesus wanted most during that last little bit of time he knew that he had to spend with these people? I think he was probably looking for encouragement from them. I think he was probably looking for companionship. When you're going through difficult times in life, it's always good to have encouraging people by your side. And great companions can do that. They can encourage you in a very positive way. But what did they do? Well, they went to sleep. That wasn't very encouraging for Christ. And it was really easy for these guys, to talk about their faithfulness to Jesus, what all they were willing to do for him. But when the test came, they failed miserably in falling asleep here at the garden. Now, I always say when we read about these Bible characters, I try not to be too harsh on these people, because generally I think if we look at them, we're kind of guilty of the same things that they're guilty of in a lot of different ways. But I want to challenge us this morning to kind of look at ourselves and look at this human behavior in the garden and think about what can we learn from that. I think what we're going to see is we can learn some things that we should do when it comes to our behavior. We can learn some things that we shouldn't do. And we can also learn how our behavior can affect other people in a positive and in a negative way too. So 4 different types of behavior that we're going to take a look at in this garden this morning. The first one is a very familiar one. We've looked at it time and time again. I almost feel guilty when I bring it up, but it's brought up in the Bible again, and so we're going to be past Judas here in a while, and I promise you probably won't have to hear about him for a very long time. But right now, that's one of the main characters that is the focus is upon in this story of Christ. And we know that Judas was very deceptive when it came to his dealings, not only with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, but also just with the disciples and Christianity in general. You know, he pretended to be a very devout, a very faithful man. He was a thief, the Bible says. He stole from the bag, from the purse, time and time again. And so he just wasn't a very good individual. But if you look in verse 43 of Mark 14, the Bible says this, "And immediately while he yet spake," speaking of Jesus here, "cometh Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude of swords and staves, from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. And he that betrayed him had given him a token, saying, Whomsoever I shall kiss, the same is he. Take him and lead him away safely. And as soon as he was come, he goeth straightway to him and saith, Master, Master, and kissed him." When I think about human behavior, one of the things that I've observed over the years is deception. When a person first starts practicing deception, it kind of goes through a process, I think, where it grows. Generally speaking, it has a way of compounding itself until a person is probably capable of actions that at first they didn't believe that they were even capable of. But deception is a very dangerous road. And we've already read in this story, of course, how Judas took it upon himself. The Jews didn't approach him, but Judas took it upon himself to approach the Sanhedrin Council. Those were the top of the Jews, all the guys who were in charge. And so Judas goes to them and he offers. They didn't ask him, but he offers to betray Jesus. He says, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver Jesus into your hands?" And so they made that agreement, and the Sanhedrin Council authorizes him to kind of lead this group out to the Garden of Gethsemane. And Judas had outlined this plan. He said, here's how it's going to work. Okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to kiss Jesus. That's the way you're going to know that this is the guy you need to arrest. And when I identify you to him by kissing him, that's your signal. That's your key to rush in and arrest him and get him out of there so that, we don't have to worry about getting in a fight and nobody dies. But Judas had come up with this very plan himself. Now, a couple of things that's worth further study and noting is the word kiss in the original language. There's actually 2 different words that are used throughout this scene in the Garden of Gethsemane. What you learn about when you turn over to Luke chapter 22, this is a parallel. I mentioned this before, but a lot of these parallels of these stories you'll find in the gospel accounts. But in Luke 22 and verse 48, Jesus says unto Judas, whenever Judas comes and kisses him, he says, "Betrayest thou the Son of Man with a kiss?" Now I want you to think about the depth of deception that Judas is going to by using the idea of a kiss. Okay? Now us, a kiss to us is a little bit different than what it was for them in that day and age. But a kiss for them was the normal way of greeting. Some cultures, some countries today still use that formal greeting. When they meet one another, they kiss one another. For us, we do a handshake, right? But not all handshakes are on the same level, are they? You understand my drift here? Sometimes you just have that kind of formal introductory handshake. When you meet somebody for the first time, you say, it's good to meet you. Sometimes when you see maybe a family member or maybe even a brother or sister in Christ that you have a relationship with and you haven't seen for a very long time, you shake hands and you say, "Bring it in," right? There's a level of closeness and intimacy to that handshake that's different from a normal handshake. And what you read about in the word, that's the two different words that are translated as kiss here, they kind of carry that same idea that we would carry with our greeting with a handshake. But here's Judas's plan. When Judas explains his plan to the crowd, he uses the word philein. That's the Greek word for kiss. It just simply means a kiss of courtesy or a kiss of greeting. In other words, Judas says, I'm going to go up there and I'm just going to greet him. I'm going to shake hands with him. And when I shake his hand, that's the one who you're supposed to arrest. But when the actual moment comes in the garden, when Judas kisses Jesus, a different word is used. It emphasizes it's the kata philein. And so there's an emphasis on the pouring on of the kiss. And you might say, well, what's the difference in how he explained it to the crowd and actually what he did? That kata philein means a kiss of intimacy, a kiss of closeness. Now, it doesn't indicate anything necessarily sexual in nature, but it just means it's the kiss of the deepest affection that you could give a person in that day and age. And so here comes Judas, and he's not just kissing Jesus. He's not just formally greeting Jesus. He's pouring it on. Oh, buddy, my long-lost friend. I missed you. And so he's giving this sign that he has this deepest affection for Christ, when in fact we know that his heart is as far as it can be from him. He's showing how much he loved Christ. But Jesus wasn't fooled at all, was he? The Bible tells us that Jesus immediately says, are you going to betray me with a kiss, really? That you're going to give me up. You're going to act like you love me, and you're going to act like you have such great care and affection for me, but really you're betraying me, and you're going to do it through this act that depicts to everybody else that you have these tremendous feelings for me. It's a great lesson for us as Christians. The Hebrew writer tells us in Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 12, he says, take heed, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. Judas was a professed follower of Jesus, right? He was one of the 12 original apostles. But he actually ended up taking the lead against Christ in his betrayal and his arrest. How did he do that? His downward fall began by stealing a little here and there, and he became bolder and bolder, and he ended up falling so far that he actually becomes the betrayer and the leader against Jesus. Now, what I want for us to learn from that, what I want to learn from that, or apply from that, is that little sins are dangerous for any disciple of Jesus. And I say that loosely, little sins and big sins, But what began as something so small led to something much bigger, didn't it? It led to Judas actually rebelling against Christ and actually betraying him and actually taking the lead. He was the guy who was responsible for everything that was happening that night. He was the one who was directing people. He was the one who came up with the plan. And so he fell so far from just being, this petty thief to actually rebelling against Christ. But I think we also have to be careful as Christians too. We have to be careful that we don't act like Judas. We don't want to come in here on a Sunday and pour it on like, boy, we love God, We've been out of touch for so long, and then when we walk out the doors and the rest of the week, just live however we want to live. We don't want to be that type of deceptive disciple. We don't want to be the type of person who wants to keep up the outward appearances and just use Jesus for our own personal agendas. But certainly that was something that could be said of Judas. The second human behavior that I want for us to observe here within this garden is courage. But it was a confused courage when you study it. Look back in verse 43. A couple of things I want to point out about the arrest of Jesus here. Judas came with, in verse 43, it says, Mark 14 here, a great multitude with swords, and the King James Version says staves. We might say clubs, or basically a stick. Whatever people could find as a weapon, that's what they were carrying, some kind of blunt object in order to accomplish their purpose. Now, a couple of things that stand out to me. First of all, you're overkill. Okay, you're going to arrest one man. You know that he only has 11 other disciples. How many guys do you need to do that? Well, you got the temple guard. Undoubtedly, they're part of this process. They weren't a big group in and of themselves, but their job as soldiers of the temple, the Sanhedrin council gave them into the hands of Judas to help accomplish this, but they just basically kept the peace in the temple. If any disturbance arose, they were in charge of, taking care of that. So you had the temple guard. You had also Roman soldiers that had been given to them by the Sanhedrin council. You had a group of soldiers that comes along with them, and then you read about, the way that, at least that I gather it, is you read about this crowd that kind of joins in the process. I've said this before, but if you grew up in public school and you ever observed a fight between two people, usually it starts out with one person walking, or maybe he and his buddies walking. Pretty soon you get a big group behind them that's following when they learn what's going on. I think that's kind of what you have here. You have all these people that they're picking up along the way. Are they authorized soldiers? No. But you come, and he comes, the Bible describes it as this, a multitude. I don't know how many people were in this arresting squad, but I would say it's probably safe to guarantee it was over 100 people. This great multitude comes to arrest Jesus Christ. And you got the soldiers, you got the people who are armed, you also got this band of vigilantes who have grabbed the nearest weapon on their way. And so you have a stage that is set for violence. I mean, anytime you start involving a vigilante process, it usually doesn't end in a good way. Some people believe this is the way that the Jews actually set it up. They believe that these Jews wanted this big fight to take place and some people to get killed so they could charge Jesus with insurrection. And that, from the Jewish standpoint, that would probably make a little bit of sense. That's not what Judas had in mind, but I think that's what probably the leaders of the Sanhedrin council had in mind. So they were looking for a reason, though, to send the Romans, or to send Jesus in front of the Romans. They probably thought this too. They probably thought, well, he's going to try to escape. Or they might have thought, well, what if his followers decide they want to put up a fight? We got to be ready. We got to be prepared for those things. So here's what happens. Mark chapter 14 and verse 47. They come with this great multitude. They're armed with swords and with clubs. And they laid their hands on him, that is of Jesus, and took him. In verse 47 it says, and one of them that stood by drew a sword and smote a servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. I want you to think about, sometimes we talk about the disciples and how they ran away on the night of Jesus' betrayal. But there was one guy who didn't run away at first, wasn't there? There was one guy who we might look at and say, well, he was either tremendously foolish or else he was really courageous. I don't know how you would describe Peter. But if a multitude came against you with swords and clubs, I probably wouldn't be drawing out my sword and striking first blood or spilling first blood, would you? These people were far outnumbered. I don't know the exact numbers. They possessed inferior weapons, but yet they had the courage to stand up and to fight to fight against these enemies of Jesus. Peter was not going to let Jesus get arrested. He was not going to let them take him away without at least a fight occurring, and it had to go. It had to go through Peter's mind that, hey, I could die in this process. Listen, I've said this before. When Peter cut off this servant of the high priest's ear, he wasn't aiming at his ear, friends. Okay? Guy ducked. And thankfully he ducked, or else he wouldn't have had a head. I'll tell you, that's just how it went. Now, you can read some of the other accounts, and you'll kind of glean that from it too. But he was not aiming for his ear. And so he had to know that there was a real chance that he was going to die in this process. Far outnumbered, inferior weapons, yet he had the courage to fight. Now, Mark doesn't identify the person who drew the sword and cut off the servant of the high priest's ear, but John does. John identifies both the culprit and the victim. In John chapter 18 and verse 10, John would say this. He said, then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and smote the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. What do we know about Peter? Unlike Judas, Peter was a true follower of Jesus, wasn't he? Peter is doing everything within his power to be true to his word, something that he had told Christ a little bit earlier. He said, though all men will deny you, yet I will die with you. I'll go to the death with you, he said. And he's a guy who's being true to his word here. He was ready to die for Christ. Drew his sword, he was fighting for him, had to know that it probably wasn't going to end in his favor. But when Jesus is threatened, and when they come in and this mob lays their hands on him and takes him, the Bible says Peter immediately draws out his sword and he swings and he ends up cutting off the ear of one of the people there in that mob. Luke goes even further though, and he tells us the conclusion of this incident. In Luke chapter 22 and verse 51, Jesus turns to Peter and he says, suffer ye thus far. And then he says he touched his ear, that is Malchus's ear, and healed him. I want you to think about what Peter did, how his behavior endangered all the disciples that day. And it was all because of confusion, wasn't it? It was misguided courage. Okay, was he a courageous guy? Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt he had great courage. Was his courage misguided? Yes. Totally. But thankfully, because of what Jesus does, I think there's a lot of violence that is avoided in this particular story. Peter undoubtedly put the life of that entire company at risk. What do you think would have happened if Jesus hadn't healed that guy's ear? There might be 4 crosses on Calvary when we read about it if Jesus hadn't healed his ear. But I think by healing him, kind of helped out his cause and helped out at least the cause of his disciples and allowing for them to get away without any further harm. But Peter's, his courage is commendable. His method is what's mistaken. In fact, in Matthew 26 and verse 52, Jesus says to Peter, put up again thy sword into his place, for all that take the sword shall perish with the sword. These guys could not understand why Jesus wasn't fighting. Okay, they knew that he could blast these guys away. They knew that if Jesus really wanted to fight against them, there wasn't going to be a contest. But why does he just give up? Why does he allow them to arrest him? And that's something that they couldn't understand. For 3 whole years, they went with Christ, but they failed to grasp the spiritual nature of the kingdom. Peter was not a coward, but his problem was spiritual understanding. And that's a great lesson for us today. There are a lot of people in the religious world today who are anything but a coward. They're very bold for what they believe. They're very bold in their actions and in their words. The problem that a lot of people in the religious world today lack is not courage. The problem is a lack of spiritual understanding, a misguided courage. And that was Peter in a nutshell here. He was wrong, he was misguided, he misunderstood. And so we got to be sure that our behavior, we need to be bold and courageous when it comes to Christianity, but we also need to be sure that we have the spiritual understanding that goes along with it so that courage is not misguided. The third behavior that you'll see within the garden relates to Jesus. And this has always been, in all the things that Christ endures, he has to go through. This has always been one of those things that I've thought a lot about. But he is completely calm through the entire process. Even when he's brought before Pilate and accusations are made, he doesn't really, make a big deal about it. Even when he's beaten, even when he's crucified, he's not out of control with anger or any other emotion. He's just this calm, cool, and collected guy through all these things. And so notice his reaction in verse 48 of Mark 14. Jesus answered and said to them, are you come out as against a thief, with swords and with staves to take me? I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and you took me not. But the scriptures must needs be fulfilled. when you read about all the people involved in the arrest of Christ, you know the only sensible person in the whole process is Jesus. And here's what I guess the irony of that is he was the one who had the most to lose. But yet he's the guy who is calm and cool and collected through the entire process. You know, he's basically explaining to them this. He says, you guys are acting like I stole something from you. You know, you come out here with this huge multitude, you're acting like I did something wrong to you. All these swords, these weapons, and these clubs. He said, you saw me every day. Okay, I was standing in that temple, you saw me, you could have arrested me there. You didn't have to come out here in this big scene with all these soldiers and these weapons. But why did they do what they did? Well, all he did was preach a message that they didn't agree with. And it just happened to be that the message that he preached was the message of truth. One of the things that we have to understand as Christians is this. If we want people to be saved, you got to tell them the truth. You're not going to do them any favors by telling them error or not telling them anything. You got to tell them the truth. And that's what Jesus did. Did it make enemies? Yes, it did. Did people always agree with him? No, they did not. Did some people react inappropriately? Yes, they did. But here's what you'll always find about Christ. One of the questions that I think about is, how can you remain so calm and cool and collected through all these things? And the more that I thought about it, the more the answer became obvious to me. The answer is obedience. Okay, Christ knew he was in complete obedience to God's will. And if you're in complete obedience, do you have anything to worry about? Do you have any reason to panic? I mean, he knew that everything was all right. The times that I panic and the times that I get out of whack is when I'm in disobedience to God's will. Isn't it the same with you? If I'm doing what God told me to do, I'm not worried about it. But that was the life of Christ. Complete calmness, complete coolness in all the difficult situations of life. Mass confusion going on here in the garden. Christ has serenity. He has peace of mind. Notice what he says, or as it's recorded in John 18, verses 4 through 8. Jesus, knowing all things that should come upon him, went forth and said unto them, Whom seek ye? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said unto them, I am he. And Judas also, which betrayed him, stood with them. As soon then as he had said unto them, I am he, they went backward and fell to the ground. Then asked he them again, Whom seek ye? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. Christ didn't lie about who he was. He didn't run away in terror. And the crowd was taken aback by his behavior, wasn't it? I wish I had more time to talk about them stepping back a little bit and taking a knee. It has to do with who Christ said he was, and I'm not going to that or I'll get too far off. But the point is this, he was cool, calm, he was collected, and you know the reason he could be that way? Because he was truthful. When you tell the truth, you have anything to worry about? No. It's when you start lying, when you start doing things that you're not supposed to be doing, that's time to panic. It's time to worry. It's time to have concern. But not when you're in complete obedience to God. The fourth behavior, feral fear, wild fear. You see that reaction from some of his disciples here. If you look at John 18, this isn't found in Mark's account. In John 18 and verse 7, again, Jesus asked them who they sought. They said, well, we're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. In verse 8, here's what Jesus says. He says, I have told you that I am he. If therefore ye seek me, let these, speaking of his 11 apostles, go their way. Now, his disciples, here's what Jesus knew. His disciples were in real danger. But Jesus takes the lead by trying to keep him safe. What is he saying? He's saying, listen, I'll go without a fight if you'll let these guys go. Okay, you said in your own words you came here to arrest me. Here I am. These guys haven't done anything. Just let them go in peace. You know what? The problem with that is this. If you go on to read John's account, that's when Peter drew out his sword. Right after Christ says this, these guys haven't done anything. They're innocent. Let them go. Peter draws out his sword and whacks off the guy's ear. And then you know what happens? Verse 50 of Mark 14, they all forsook him and fled. That's when everybody took off running. Because they knew then that it was not going to be good, right? All of them forsook him and fled. But in verse 51 of Mark 14, you'll read this. There followed him a certain young man, having a linen cloth cast about his naked body. And the young men laid hold on him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. What did his disciples do? They all ran for the hills, didn't they? And we read about one young man, not necessarily part of the intimate group of Jesus, but one young man who is caught in the middle of this, who exhibits his fear, just like all these other apostles. How did they exhibit their fear? By running away. But this guy was so intent on running away, the Bible says he was bare naked, right? All he had was a blanket covering himself. They tried to grab a hold of him, and he had to leave the blanket behind and run off naked. I remember as a child, that was one of my most fearful nightmares. You know, here you are standing in front of everybody and you're buck naked. That's just not what you want to do. But if you had a choice between dying or living and saying, hey, I got to leave this behind, which one you go choose? Not a hard choice, is it? Why did he do that? Because he was afraid. Who is this young man? Well, that's the $100 question, right? Most commentators agree this is probably John Mark. This is probably the guy who wrote, the book that we're reading here. This is probably, and in fact, you think about his character is a lot like that too, isn't it? You read in the book of Acts, what happened when the going got tough? He ran away, didn't he? When Paul went on missionary trips, could have done a lot of different things for the cause of Christ. But we learned he was a young man. He's just a young guy at this point. As Christians, the Bible tells us, 2 Timothy 1 and verse 8, be not thou therefore ashamed of the testimony of our Lord. And then Paul goes on to say, nor of me as his prisoners. How many times are we ashamed of Christ because of fear? How many times are we trying to escape embarrassment or ridicule? Thankfully, in our nation, we don't really have the physical threat and the persecutions that exist in some nations today. But there are some people who have to worry about that, don't they? And generally, what do you do when you're afraid? You compromise, don't you? You run away. It's common for human beings to do that, but it's especially common for young people to do that. And here we read about this young man who, instead of standing up for Christ, instead of clearly saying, I'm on his side, I'm with him, forsake him, leave him running behind, leave him behind in order to save his own skin. We got to be careful as Christians that we don't do that too. Sometimes we leave Jesus behind because we're afraid we're going to be embarrassed. Sometimes we leave him behind because we don't want anybody to ridicule us, right? So we'll not bring up Christ for the fact that we're on his side. Can't allow that behavior. These men's behavior in the garden, they were telling signs of who they were. In our behavior toward other people and our circumstances in life, they tell a lot about the kind of person that we are. So think about these 4 different types of behavior. Ask ourselves these questions as we end this morning. Do we pour it on for Jesus on Sunday, but live for ourselves the rest of the week? Are we being courageous for Christ, but we don't have the spiritual understanding to go behind that great courage or boldness that we're exhibiting for him? Do we remain cool, calm, and collected in the face of mass chaos and confusion? Somebody says, how can we do that? Obedience. Are we wildly fearful of embarrassment or ridicule so that we run away and leave Jesus behind? The way that we behave tells a lot about the type of person that we are. It tells a lot about these individuals, tells a lot about us too. Maybe there's one